The cockpit of the Bristol Beaufighter trembled at 18,000 feet above the Adriatic Sea, its twin Hercules engines producing a steady bass hum that vibrated through Flight Lieutenant David Harper's spine and into his teeth. It was 11:47 p.m. on September 14, 1943, and the moon hung like a broken coin above the water, casting just enough light to distinguish sea from sky, but not enough to reveal what moved between them. Harper's hands rested lightly on the controls, his body attuned to every shift in air pressure, every change in the aircraft's breathing. In the rear seat, radio operator Malcolm Reeves hunched over his equipment, headphones pressed against his ears, eyes closed in concentration as he listened to the static-filled darkness. They were hunting German transport aircraft, the ungainly Junkers Ju-52s that ferried supplies and reinforcements from Italy to the Balkans under cover of night, flying low and slow across the water to avoid radar detection. For 6 weeks, Harper's squadron had been tasked with intercepting these transports, and for 6 weeks, they had found almost nothing. The Germans seemed to vanish into the Mediterranean darkness, their flight paths unpredictable, their timing erratic. Intelligence reports suggested they were moving hundreds of tons of material every week, yet RAF night fighters returned empty-handed more often than not, their fuel exhausted, their ammunition unfired, their reports filed with the bitter notation, "No contact established." Harper had flown 23 such missions. He knew the coordinates where transports had been spotted before. He knew the likely routes from Italian airfields to Greek islands. He knew the altitudes Germans preferred and the speeds their overloaded aircraft could maintain. None of it mattered. The Adriatic had become a theater of invisibility, where knowing where your enemy should be meant nothing if you couldn't find them when you arrived. Reeves tapped Harper's shoulder, 2 quick taps, the signal for something odd. Harper eased back on the throttle, reducing engine noise, letting the Beaufighter glide slightly as Reeves adjusted frequencies on his radio equipment. The British aircraft were equipped with airborne intercept radar, a technological marvel that could detect other planes in darkness. But the radar was temperamental, its range limited, its signals confused by sea return and weather. More often than useful, it showed ghosts, false contacts that sent fighters chasing empty air while real targets slipped past. Reeves wasn't using the radar now. His hand moved across the radio tuning dial with surgical precision, stopping at intervals, lingering, moving on. Harper watched the altimeter and airspeed indicator, maintaining a gentle banking turn that kept them circling over the same patch of sea. Below, the water was black, except where moonlight caught the crests of waves, turning them briefly silver before they dissolved back into darkness. Then Reeves went completely still. His right hand froze on the tuning dial. His left hand slowly lifted one headphone away from his ear, as if confirming what he heard. He leaned forward and spoke directly into Harper's ear, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "I've got voices. German voices. Praying." Harper's first instinct was to dismiss it. Radio operators often picked up fragments of broadcasts, commercial stations, military traffic from distant theaters, even atmospheric echoes of conversations from hundreds of miles away. The electromagnetic spectrum was crowded with voices, and tuning a radio at night over water was like opening a door into a room where 1,000 people were speaking at once, in a dozen languages. But Reeves was not an excitable man. Before the war, he had worked as a sound engineer for the BBC, recording orchestras and theatre performances, a job that demanded precise auditory discrimination. If Reeves said he heard German voices praying, Harper believed he heard German voices praying. "Can you tell where?" Harper asked. Reeves shook his head, still listening. "Close, very close. They're broadcasting on a frequency I've never monitored before. Low band, civilian range, not military traffic. It sounds like a shortwave radio inside an aircraft. Someone's microphone is open." Harper felt the skin on his arms tighten. An open microphone. It was a basic operational error, the kind of mistake student pilots made during training, failing to switch from intercom to radio, accidentally transmitting internal conversations to everyone within range. But German transport crews were not students. They were veterans, men who had flown hundreds of missions. They knew their equipment, which meant this wasn't incompetence. It was something else. Reeves continued listening, his face pale in the dim red glow of the instrument panel. They're reciting something, all of them together. It's not tactical communication. It's liturgical. Latin phrases mixed with German. I think it's the Rosary. Harper banked the Beaufighter more steeply, scanning the darkness below. The radar screen showed nothing but clutter. Visually, the night was a featureless black canvas. Yet somewhere within a few miles, a transport aircraft full of German soldiers was flying through hostile airspace with an open microphone, broadcasting prayers. "Can you get a bearing?" Harper asked. Reeves adjusted his equipment, rotating a small directional loop antenna mounted above his head. Radio direction finding was an art, not a science. Signals bounced off water, refracted through atmospheric layers, bent around obstacles. But with patience, an experienced operator could narrow down a source to within a few degrees of accuracy. Reeves rotated the loop slowly, listening for the point where the signal strength peaked. "Southeast," he said finally. "Maybe 10 miles. Signal is strong. They're close to the water." Harper pushed the throttles forward and brought the Beaufighter around to a heading of 135 degrees. The engines roared back to full power, and the aircraft surged ahead, climbing slightly to gain better visibility. He kept his eyes moving. Instruments, horizon, darkness below, instruments again. The Beaufighter was a formidable night fighter, heavily armed with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, but it was useless if you couldn't find your target. Radar had promised to solve that problem. Radar had failed more often than it succeeded. Reeves kept the headphones pressed to his ears, listening. "They're still praying," he said. "I can hear the pilot's voice now. He's leading the others. They're on the 5th decade. Sorrowful mysteries." Harper had grown up Catholic. He recognized the structure of the Rosary, the rhythm of repeated prayers, the meditative cadence designed to focus the mind and calm fear. German transport crews had every reason to pray. Flying over the Adriatic at night in a slow, unarmed aircraft was a death sentence if you were spotted. RAF and USAAF night fighters prowled these skies, and a Ju-52 had no defense except darkness and luck. If the Germans believed prayer might improve their odds, Harper couldn't fault them. But why were they broadcasting? The question gnawed at him as the Beaufighter knifed through the darkness. Reeves continued providing updates, signal strength increasing, bearing steady, prayers ongoing. Harper reduced altitude gradually, descending to 12,000 feet, then 10,000, scanning the blackness ahead and below for any sign of movement. Moonlight was fickle, sometimes revealing, mostly concealing. He needed the Germans to make a mistake, to cross a patch of illuminated water or silhouette themselves against clouds. At 8,000 feet, he saw them. Not the aircraft itself, but its shadow. A dark cross moving slowly across a patch of sea where moonlight reflected off gentle swells. Harper's breath caught. He eased back on the throttles, letting the Beaufighter slow, reducing closure speed to avoid overshooting. The shadow grew more distinct, wings, fuselage, tail. A Junkers Ju-52, exactly as intelligence had described. 3 engines, corrugated metal skin, lumbering through the air at perhaps 150 miles per hour. It was flying less than 500 feet above the water, so low that Harper could see faint white streaks where its propeller wash disturbed the surface. Reeves whispered urgently, "They're finishing the Rosary. Last prayer now." Harper positioned the Beaufighter 2,000 feet behind and slightly above the transport, matching its speed, keeping it in sight. Standard procedure was to close rapidly, identify the target with certainty, and open fire before the enemy could react. But something made Harper hesitate. The open microphone, the prayers, the reckless altitude. It felt wrong, not like a veteran crew executing a careful night transit, but like men who had abandoned caution entirely. "Are they still broadcasting?" Harper asked. "Yes, wait, they've finished the Rosary. Someone's speaking now. Different voice, younger. He's asking the pilot if they should climb. The pilot says no, stay low. The British radar can't see us down here." Harper felt a cold certainty settle into his chest. The Germans weren't making a mistake. They were executing a deliberate strategy, flying beneath radar coverage, using altitude as their primary defense. And the open microphone wasn't incompetence. It was desperation. The crew was so focused on staying low, on maintaining formation with other transports, Harper couldn't yet see that someone had forgotten to close the channel after coordinating with wingmen. Or perhaps the radio was malfunctioning, stuck in transmit mode. Either way, the Germans had no idea they were broadcasting their position to anyone listening on the right frequency. Reeves tapped Harper's shoulder again. "There's more. I'm picking up 2 additional signals now, same frequency. Fainter, but definitely there. I think there are 3 transports flying together." Harper scanned the darkness ahead of the Ju-52 he was tracking. At first he saw nothing. Then as the moon briefly emerged from behind a wisp of cloud, he spotted them, 2 more shadows, widely spaced, following the same heading at the same altitude. A 3-aircraft flight, carrying perhaps 60 soldiers and tons of supplies, creeping across the Adriatic in a thin shell of assumed invisibility. The tactical mathematics were simple. Harper's Beaufighter carried enough ammunition to destroy all 3 transports. The Germans were unarmed, slow, and unaware they were being followed. In 3 passes, Harper could eliminate the entire flight before they even understood they were under attack. It would be a textbook intercept, exactly the kind of success Fighter Command needed to justify continued night operations over the Mediterranean. But Harper didn't close for the kill. Instead, he maintained his position astern, watching, thinking. The open microphone had given him an advantage no radar could match. He could hear the Germans planning, discussing, praying. He could listen to their fear and their hope. And if one transport crew had made this mistake tonight, others would make it tomorrow, or the next night, or the night after that. The Germans believed their low-altitude tactics made them invisible. They relied on that belief, which meant they would continue broadcasting inadvertently, continue revealing themselves, continue trusting a defense that had already been compromised. Reeves leaned forward. "Are we engaging?" Harper didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about 6 weeks of empty patrols, about intelligence officers frustrated by lack of results, about night fighter crews returning with nothing to show for hours of flying. The Germans had developed a system that worked. Low altitude, radio silence during critical phases, unpredictable timing. Except they hadn't maintained radio silence. One crew, perhaps several crews, were inadvertently broadcasting their movements on frequencies British radio operators rarely monitored because they weren't considered militarily relevant. "Not yet," Harper said finally. "I want to follow them. See where they're going." Reeves looked uncertain. "We have fuel for maybe 40 more minutes of combat operations. If we follow them all the way to their destination, we might not have enough to engage and make it home." "I know. But if we shoot them down now, we get 3 transports. If we learn their routes, their procedures, their frequencies, we can get dozens." It was a gamble, trading certain success for potential intelligence. Harper knew squadron commanders preferred tangible results: enemy aircraft destroyed, gun camera footage, debris fields. Following targets without engaging would raise questions. But Harper had spent 6 weeks chasing ghosts. If there was a systematic flaw in German transport operations, something exploitable, he wanted to understand it before destroying these particular aircraft. He throttled back further, increasing the distance between the Beaufighter and the trailing Ju-52. Reeves kept his headphones on, listening. The German voices continued, quieter now, no longer praying but talking about fuel consumption, navigation checkpoints, estimated time to destination. Technical conversation, routine, the kind of chatter that revealed how comfortable these men felt despite flying through enemy-controlled airspace. The transports maintained their course for another 12 minutes. Then simultaneously all three began a shallow climb. Harper watched their shadows rise away from the water, gaining altitude slowly, their engines straining. Reeves reported increased radio traffic, the pilot of the lead aircraft instructing the others to begin their approach, reminding them to extend landing gear early to allow extra spacing on final. They were preparing to land. Harper climbed with them, staying well back, trying to see where they were heading. The moon was setting now, and darkness was winning its ancient contest with light. But ahead, perhaps 15 miles, Harper saw a faint glow. Not bright enough to be a city, but too concentrated to be reflections off water. Lights, a runway. The Germans were vectoring toward an airfield Harper's intelligence briefings had never mentioned, or perhaps toward one the British thought was abandoned. Reeves pulled one headphone away. "They're on final approach. I can hear landing gear warnings, flap settings. We've got maybe 2 minutes before they're on the ground." Harper made his decision. He banked the Beaufighter into a steep turn, reversing course, pointing the nose back toward base. They had followed long enough. They had heard enough. The Germans had revealed not just their flight path, but their operational rhythm, their communication habits, their sense of security. And most importantly, they had revealed that they believed themselves invisible when they were, in fact, broadcasting their every movement to anyone who knew where to listen. As the Beaufighter accelerated westward, climbing back towards safer altitude, Harper glanced at Reeves. "When we land, I want you to write down everything you heard. Every frequency, every phrase, every detail. We're going to take this to intelligence." Reeves nodded, still listening through his headphones, even as the German signals faded into distance and static. "You think other crews are making the same mistake?" "I think," Harper said slowly, "that the Germans have a communications procedure they believe is secure, and I think they're wrong. Which means we've just found a way to hear them when they think they're whispering." The Beaufighter's engines settled into their steady cruise rhythm, carrying the aircraft back across the dark Adriatic toward Italy and the airfield, where questions would be asked and reports would be filed. Harper was already rehearsing what he would say to his commanding officer, how he would explain why he had broken off contact with 3 confirmed targets to follow them to an unknown destination. It would sound like poor judgment. It might sound like cowardice, but Harper had heard something in those German voices beyond words and prayers. He had heard a pattern, and patterns could be exploited. The war in the Mediterranean was being fought with radar and radio, with technology and countermeasures, with innovations that gave temporary advantage until the enemy adapted. What Harper had discovered tonight wasn't a technological breakthrough. It was simpler and stranger. The enemy was telling him exactly where they were, and they didn't even know it. Wing Commander Gerald Pettigrew's office smelled of pipe tobacco and mildew, a combination that seemed to define every military building in southern Italy, where British forces had established themselves after the invasion. It was 9:30 a.m. on September 15th, and Harper stood at attention in front of Pettigrew's desk while the wing commander read through the mission report for the 3rd time, his thick grey eyebrows drawing closer together with each page. Reeves stood beside Harper, hands clasped behind his back, his expression carefully neutral. Through the window behind Pettigrew, Harper could see mechanics working on a damaged Hurricane, their tools clanking against metal, their voices carrying across the dispersal area. Pettigrew finally set the report down and looked up. He was a veteran of the Great War, a man who had flown primitive biplanes over Flanders and survived when most of his generation had not. His face showed every one of his 48 years, deeply lined, perpetually skeptical, shaped by decades of military bureaucracy and operational disappointments. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," he said, his voice carrying the particular weariness of an officer who has heard too many unlikely stories. You established visual contact with 3 enemy transport aircraft. You had fuel, ammunition, and positional advantage. But instead of engaging, you followed them for 20 minutes and then returned to base without firing a shot. Yes. Sir, Harper said, and your justification for this decision is that the enemy was broadcasting prayers on a civilian radio frequency, which you believe indicates a systematic communications vulnerability. Yes, sir. Pettigrew picked up his pipe, examined it, and set it down without lighting it. Flight Lieutenant, in 6 weeks of operations, your squadron has achieved precisely 4 confirmed kills. 4. Intelligence estimates the Germans are running 30 to 40 transport sorties per week across the Adriatic. We're barely making a dent. And last night, when you had 3 confirmed targets in your sights, you chose to play wireless operator instead of fighter pilot. Harper had anticipated this response. He had spent most of the flight back to base constructing his argument, and he delivered it now with as much precision as he could manage. Sir, if we had destroyed those 3 aircraft, we would have scored 3 victories. But we would have also alerted the Germans that their low-altitude tactics aren't as effective as they believe. They would have changed procedures, altered routes, increased radio discipline. We would have won a tactical engagement, but lost a strategic advantage. What strategic advantage? Pettigrew asked, his tone sharpening. You heard some Germans praying. That's not intelligence. That's an accident. One crew with a stuck microphone doesn't constitute a systematic vulnerability. Reeves spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but firm. Sir, with respect, I don't believe it was just one crew. While I was monitoring their frequency, I detected at least 2 other similar broadcasts over the course of the mission. Fragments of conversation, navigation updates, procedural chatter, all on the same low-band civilian frequency. All from what appeared to be transport aircraft operating in the same general area. Pettigrew turned his attention to Reeves. You're the radio operator? Yes, sir. Malcolm Reeves. Before the war, I worked in broadcast engineering. I've spent 10 years listening to radio signals professionally, and in your professional opinion, what we're dealing with is multiple German air crews inadvertently broadcasting on an unsecured frequency. That's my assessment, sir. But I believe it's more specific than just an accident. I think the Germans are using portable shortwave radios for backup communication, civilian equipment repurposed for military use. When their standard military radios fail, or when they need secondary coordination, they're switching to these backup units. And either through equipment malfunction or operator error, they're leaving channels open. Pettigrew leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving between Harper and Reeves, evaluating. Outside, a truck engine roared to life, and someone shouted orders in Italian-accented English. Finally, Pettigrew spoke. Even if you're correct, what do you propose we do about it? Station radio operators on random frequencies hoping to overhear German conversations. No, sir, Harper said. I propose we conduct a systematic survey of the radio spectrum during known transport windows. If German crews are using civilian frequencies for backup communication, there will be patterns, specific bands they favor, times when traffic increases, navigational references we can correlate with known routes. Reeves can design a monitoring protocol. We implement it across multiple aircraft. Within a week, we'll know if this is an isolated incident or a genuine vulnerability. Pettigrew picked up the mission report again, scanning the technical details Reeves had included: frequency ranges, signal characteristics, timestamps, estimated bearings. This would require authorization from Group. They'll want to know why we're diverting resources from combat operations to radio intelligence gathering. Tell them we're testing a new intercept method, Harper said. If it works, we increase our kill rate. If it doesn't, we've lost nothing but a few hours of listening time. We've lost combat patrols, Pettigrew countered. Every aircraft monitoring radio frequencies is an aircraft not hunting transports visually or by radar. Sir, our visual success rate is less than 10%. Radar performs marginally better, but is unreliable at low altitudes. What Reeves heard last night gave us perfect situational awareness. We knew exactly where 3 transports were, what altitude they were flying, where they were going, and when they would arrive. That's better intelligence than any radar has provided. Pettigrew was quiet again, thinking. Harper could see the calculation happening behind the wing commander's eyes, weighing risk against potential reward, considering how this would look in reports to higher command, evaluating whether 2 junior officers had stumbled onto something valuable or were wasting his time with wishful thinking. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. Finally, Pettigrew nodded slowly. 1 week, he said. I'll authorize monitoring operations for 1 week. Reeves, you'll coordinate with our other radio operators. Provide them with frequency lists and monitoring protocols. Harper, you'll fly standard combat patrols, but with radio intercept as primary mission objective. If you hear something actionable, you're cleared to engage. If not, you document it and move on. At the end of 7 days, I want a full report with evidence that this approach produces results. Understood? Yes, sir, Harper and Reeves said simultaneously. Dismissed, they left Pettigrew's office and walked across the airfield toward the operations building, where radio equipment was maintained and technical specialists worked in cluttered rooms filled with oscilloscopes and wire spools. The morning sun was already fierce, promising another sweltering Italian afternoon. Reeves carried a canvas bag containing his notes from the previous night's mission, pages of frequency logs, signal strength measurements, transcribed German phrases, and hand-drawn diagrams of antenna orientations. He doesn't believe us, Reeves said, once they were out of earshot of the headquarters building. He believes us enough to give us a week, Harper replied. That's more than I expected. They found the radio section housed in a former farmhouse, its stone walls providing some relief from the heat. Inside, 3 radio operators were working on various pieces of equipment, their benches covered with vacuum tubes, solder, and technical manuals. Reeves knew them all. They formed a small, specialized community within the squadron. Men whose technical knowledge made them invaluable, but whose work was often invisible to pilots focused on flying and fighting. Reeves gathered them around a table and spread out his notes. For the next 2 hours, he explained what he and Harper had discovered, walking the operators through the frequencies, the type of signals, the characteristics that distinguished military from civilian transmissions. The operators listened with varying degrees of skepticism, but Reeves spoke their language: bandwidth, modulation, atmospheric propagation, antenna patterns. By the time he finished, they were asking technical questions rather than expressing doubts. You want us to monitor these frequencies during combat patrols? Asked Sergeant Donald Price, the senior radio operator, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and hands perpetually stained with soldering flux. During night patrols, specifically, Reeves said. German transports fly almost exclusively at night. We focus monitoring between 2200 and 0400 hours, covering the frequency bands I've identified. When you detect a signal that matches the characteristics I've described, you take a bearing, estimate distance if possible, and direct your pilot to intercept. What if we pick up friendly traffic? Another operator asked. Civilian bands are crowded. We might spend all night chasing Italian fishing boats. That's why we correlate signals with other intelligence, Reeves explained. If you hear German voices, that's obvious. But even if you can't understand the language, there are indicators, military terminology, navigation references, engine sounds in the background. I'll create a checklist. You evaluate each signal against the criteria before recommending intercept. Price nodded slowly. It's clever, risky but clever. If the Germans are really this sloppy with their radio discipline, we should be able to map their entire operation within a few nights. That's the idea, Reeves said. But we need to be systematic. I want logs from every patrol, Frequencies monitored, signals detected, intercepts attempted, results. After a week, we'll have enough data to prove whether this works or whether we're chasing ghosts. The operators spent the rest of the day preparing equipment. They tested receivers, calibrated directional antennas, created frequency charts that could be referenced quickly in darkened cockpits. Reeves worked alongside them, his BBC engineering experience evident in the way he approached problems, methodically, patiently, with an instinct for signal behavior that came from years of listening to invisible electromagnetic phenomena. Harper, meanwhile, met with other pilots explaining the new intercept protocol. Some were enthusiastic, seeing it as a potential breakthrough. Others were dismissive, arguing that listening to radios was intelligence work, not fighter pilot work, and that their job was to find and destroy enemy aircraft, not to eavesdrop on conversations. Harper understood both perspectives. He had been a fighter pilot long enough to value direct action, to want the satisfaction of pulling the trigger and seeing results. But he had also flown enough empty patrols to know that traditional methods were failing. That night, 4 Beaufighters took off on patrol. Harper flew one. Each aircraft carried a radio operator equipped with Reeves's frequency lists and monitoring protocols. The moon was darker than the previous night, a waning crescent that provided almost no illumination. Flying conditions were challenging, with broken clouds at multiple altitudes and a gusty wind from the northeast that made precise navigation difficult. Harper orbited over the central Adriatic, maintaining altitude at 15,000 feet, while Reeves methodically scanned through designated frequencies. For the first 90 minutes, they heard nothing but static and occasional fragments of Italian commercial broadcasts, music, news, somebody reading what sounded like poetry. The night felt empty, the darkness complete. Harper began to wonder if the previous night had been an anomaly, a one-time stroke of luck that would never repeat. Then at 23:47, Reeves stiffened. "I've got something. German voices, same frequency as last night, different crew. I don't recognize the accents. They're discussing fuel consumption and estimated time to checkpoint Alpha." Harper felt his pulse quicken. "Can you get a bearing?" Reeves adjusted his directional antenna, rotating it slowly. "Southeast, strong signal. I estimate less than 15 miles. Harper turned the Beaufighter onto the indicated heading and began descending. This time he knew what to look for, not radar contacts or visual silhouettes, but the invisible thread of radio transmission leading him toward his target. Reeves continued listening, reporting updates. The Germans were relaxed, conversational. One crew member complained about the cold. Another mentioned his girlfriend in Munich. A third wondered aloud whether the war would be over by Christmas. At 12,000 feet, Harper spotted them. 2 transports, not 3, flying in loose formation about a mile apart. They were lower than the previous night's aircraft, barely 300 feet above the water, their shapes barely distinguishable from the Black Sea below. Harper positioned himself above and behind, matching their speed, watching. Reeves continued monitoring their conversation, which had shifted to navigation, confirming coordinates, updating estimated arrival times, discussing the condition of the runway at their destination. "Do we engage?" Reeves asked. Harper considered. They had confirmation that the phenomenon was repeating. Different crew, different night, same vulnerability. Shooting down these transports would add 2 victories to the squadron's tally. But it would also alert the Germans that something had compromised their operations. Better, Harper thought, to continue gathering intelligence, to understand the full scope of the vulnerability before exploiting it. "Not tonight," Harper said. "Let's see where they're going." They followed the transports for another 18 minutes, during which Reeves detected a third signal, another transport, several miles to the north on a parallel course. The Germans were running multiple flights simultaneously, all using the same frequencies, all broadcasting inadvertently. It was a systematic flaw, exactly as Harper had suspected. Not an isolated mistake, but a procedural weakness that affected multiple crews across multiple missions. When the transports began their final approach to what appeared to be the same airfield Harper had observed the previous night, he broke off and headed back to base. As the Beaufighter climbed away, Reeves removed his headphones and rubbed his eyes. "They have no idea," he said quietly. "They think they're invisible. They think the night protects them, but we can hear every word." Harper nodded. "Tomorrow we brief the others. If all 4 patrols got similar results tonight, Pettigrew will have to escalate this to group." They landed just after 2 a.m. The other 3 Beaufighters returned within 30 minutes, and the radio operators gathered in the operations room to compare notes. All 4 patrols had detected German transmissions on civilian frequencies. All 4 had successfully used those transmissions to locate transport aircraft. 2 patrols had tracked targets all the way to landing zones. 1 patrol had detected what appeared to be a 4-aircraft formation, the largest group yet observed. The evidence was overwhelming. The Germans had a communications vulnerability, and it was exploitable on a scale that could fundamentally alter the balance of the campaign against their transport operations. Harper spent the early morning hours compiling the data into a report, knowing that when Pettigrew read it, the wing commander would have no choice but to forward it to higher command. What had begun as one puzzling intercept had become something far larger, a window into enemy operations that no radar or visual search could provide. Group Captain Edmund Thornley arrived at the base on September 18th in a staff car that kicked up dust across the airfield and announced his presence with the kind of punctilious formality that senior officers carried like armor. He was responsible for night fighter operations across the entire Mediterranean theater, a man whose decisions affected dozens of squadrons and hundreds of aircraft. And his visit to this particular forward airfield suggested that Harper and Reeves's reports had reached levels of command where skepticism gave way to strategic interest. Thornley set up in Pettigrew's office, commandeered it really, and within an hour had assembled everyone involved in the radio intercept operations for what he termed a technical briefing and operational assessment. Harper stood at the front of the room alongside Reeves, facing a dozen officers ranging from squadron commanders to intelligence specialists. Thornley sat in the center, flanked by his aide and a signals officer from group headquarters, both of whom carried leather folders thick with reports and technical analyses. The atmosphere was formal, evaluative, the kind of meeting where careers could be advanced or ended based on whether the evidence supported the claims being made. Thornley opened without preamble. "Gentlemen, I've read your reports. 4 consecutive nights of successful intercepts based on radio monitoring with a success rate that exceeds our radar-based operations by a factor of 3. If accurate, this represents a significant intelligence breakthrough. However, before I authorize expanded operations, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Flight Lieutenant Harper, walk me through the methodology." Harper stepped forward, indicating a map of the Adriatic that had been pinned to the wall. Red marks showed locations where German transports had been detected. Blue lines traced estimated flight paths. "Sir, what we've discovered is that German transport crews are using civilian shortwave radios as backup communication systems. These radios operate on frequencies outside standard military bands, which means they've been effectively invisible to our normal monitoring protocols. However, due to either equipment malfunction or operator error, these radios are frequently left in transmit mode, broadcasting internal crew conversations to anyone listening on the correct frequencies." Thornley leaned forward. "You're telling me German transport crews are accidentally broadcasting their positions?" "Not their positions explicitly, sir, but enough information to allow us to locate them. We hear navigation discussions, altitude references, fuel calculations, approach procedures. Combined with radio direction finding, this gives us accurate intercept vectors." The signals officer spoke up, a major whose nameplate read, "Williamson." What frequencies are we talking about specifically? Reeves answered, pulling out his frequency logs. Primarily the 3 to 5 megahertz range, standard shortwave civilian bands. The Germans appear to be using portable transceivers, likely requisitioned civilian equipment as backup to their standard military radios. We believe this practice emerged as a countermeasure to our signals intelligence. They assumed civilian frequencies would be ignored by military monitors. Williamson studied the logs. They assumed correctly. We don't routinely monitor civilian bands during combat operations. There's too much traffic, too much noise. But you're saying you can isolate German military transmissions from civilian traffic? Yes, sir. Language is the primary discriminator, German versus Italian or English. But there are also technical signatures. Military aircraft produce distinctive background sounds, engine harmonics, intercom bleed, radio chatter. An experienced operator can identify military traffic within seconds of detection. Thornley turned to Pettigrew. Wing Commander, you've authorized 4 nights of monitoring operations. What have been the results in terms of confirmed intercepts and engagement success? Pettigrew consulted his own notes. 12 confirmed detections of German transport formations. 8 successful intercepts resulting in visual contact. 4 engagements, all resulting in destroyed or damaged aircraft. 0 false positives. Every detection Reeves's method identified was a genuine target. And the comparison to radar-based intercepts during the same period? Radar detected 6 contacts, 3 of which proved to be false returns or friendly aircraft. 3 genuine intercepts, 1 successful engagement. Thornley absorbed this information in silence. Harper watched the group captain's face, trying to read the calculation happening behind those pale blue eyes. Thornley had the look of a man who had spent decades in military service, who understood that innovation was often resisted by institutions that valued established procedures over experimental methods. But he also had the look of someone who recognized an opportunity when evidence supported it. The obvious question, Thornley said finally, is why the Germans continue this practice if it's compromising their operations. They're not fools. If they're losing aircraft, they'll investigate why and modify procedures accordingly. Sir, I believe they don't yet realize their communications are compromised, Harper said. From their perspective, they're being intercepted by radar or visual searches, which happen occasionally through random chance. They haven't connected their losses to radio transmissions because they don't know anyone is listening to civilian frequencies. Additionally, the crews we've monitored appear to be using these backup radios only intermittently when standard military radios fail or when they need to coordinate with other aircraft outside their normal communication net. It's not standard procedure, which means it's not documented in ways that would trigger systematic review. Williamson interjected again. But eventually they'll notice a pattern. If we start achieving significantly higher intercept rates, German intelligence will investigate. They'll identify the vulnerability and close it. Agreed, sir, Reeves said, which is why I recommend we exploit this advantage immediately and aggressively, but with careful operational security. We should brief only essential personnel, limit discussion of intercept methods in after-action reports, and attribute successes to radar or visual detection. The longer the Germans believe their losses are due to conventional means, the longer they'll continue their current practices. Thornley stood and walked to the map, studying the red marks indicating detection locations. He traced flight paths with one finger, following the patterns that had emerged over 4 nights of monitoring. If we expand this operation across the theater, we're talking about equipping dozens of aircraft with specialized monitoring equipment and training dozens of radio operators in these techniques. That's a significant resource commitment. Yes, sir, Harper acknowledged. But the potential return is equally significant. German transport operations in the Mediterranean are their logistical lifeline to Balkans garrisons. They're moving troops, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies. If we can systematically interdict those flights, We don't just reduce their operational capacity, we potentially force them to shift to daylight operations or naval transport, both of which carry higher risk and lower efficiency. Thornley turned back to face the room. The other consideration is whether this technique is replicable in other theaters. If German transport units in the Mediterranean are using civilian radios, are units elsewhere doing the same? Could this method work over the Bay of Biscay, the North Sea, or in support of Eastern Front operations? Unknown, sir, Williamson said. We'd need to conduct similar monitoring operations in those areas to determine if the practice is widespread or localized to Mediterranean command. Then that's what we'll do, Thornley decided. I'm authorizing immediate expansion of radio intercept operations in this theater, effective tonight. Wing Commander Pettigrew, you'll coordinate with other night fighter squadrons. I want monitoring equipment installed in every available aircraft and radio operators trained in Reeves's methodology within 72 hours. Flight Lieutenant Harper, you and Reeves will serve as primary instructors. You'll brief crews, demonstrate techniques, and fly initial missions with other squadrons to validate procedures. Yes, sir, Harper said, feeling both vindication and the weight of new responsibility. Thornley continued. Simultaneously, I'm forwarding this intelligence to Bomber Command, Coastal Command, and to our liaison officers with American Air Forces. If this vulnerability exists in one German transport command, it likely exists in others. We need to determine the scope before the enemy realizes what's happening. He paused, his gaze moving across the assembled officers. Gentlemen, we may have stumbled onto something that could significantly impact enemy logistics, but we have a limited window to exploit it. Once the Germans identify the problem, they'll correct it within days. Our advantage is temporary. I want maximum pressure applied immediately. The meeting dissolved into tactical planning. Radio operators gathered with Reeves to discuss equipment requirements and training schedules. Pilots clustered around Harper, asking questions about intercept procedures and engagement protocols. Intelligence officers began drafting reports for higher command, careful to describe the methodology without revealing sources in ways that might compromise operational security if documents were captured. Harper found himself explaining the same concepts repeatedly to different audiences. Some pilots understood immediately, men who had flown enough empty patrols to appreciate any method that improved success rates. Others remained skeptical, particularly veterans who distrusted technology they didn't understand and resented the implication that radio operators were now as important as pilots in achieving intercepts. Harper was patient with both groups, demonstrating with maps and scenarios how radio intercepts provided information that radar couldn't match, particularly against low-flying targets in conditions where sea return cluttered radar screens. By late afternoon, the training was underway. Reeves had assembled 8 radio operators in a classroom, where he used actual recordings from recent missions, German voices captured on wire recorders, to teach recognition techniques. He played segments repeatedly, helping operators distinguish military terminology from civilian conversation, teaching them to recognize the acoustic signatures of aircraft cockpits versus ground stations. The operators listened intently, taking notes, asking technical questions about signal propagation and atmospheric conditions that affected reception. Harper flew demonstration missions with 3 different crews, showing them how to integrate radio monitoring into standard patrol procedures. The key, he emphasized, was patience. Radio intercepts required time, methodical scanning through frequencies, waiting for signals, taking bearings, correlating information. Pilots accustomed to aggressive hunting had to learn a more measured approach, trusting their radio operators to guide them toward targets that might be invisible on radar and beneath visual range. That night, September 18th, 12 Beaufighters launched on patrol. Each carried a radio operator trained in Reeves's methodology. Harper flew with Reeves, coordinating the operation from their aircraft, monitoring both their own intercept frequency and a command channel where other crews reported their findings. The night was clear, the moon 3/4 full, providing better visibility than recent missions had offered. The results exceeded even optimistic projections. Within the first 90 minutes, radio operators across the patrol area detected 9 separate German transmissions. 6 proved to be transport aircraft, 3 individual transports, and 1 3-aircraft formation. The other 3 signals were ground stations coordinating with aircraft, providing additional intelligence about German communications networks. Harper directed intercepts based on reported bearing and signal strength, vectoring fighters toward targets with a precision that felt almost unfair. At 23:34, Harper's own intercept illustrated how effectively the system could work. Reeves detected a transmission at bearing 142 degrees, estimated range 12 miles. The German crew was discussing weather conditions and expressing concern about turbulence during approach. Harper turned toward the bearing and descended to 10,000 feet. Within 8 minutes, he had visual contact. A lone Ju-52 flying at 2,000 feet, silhouetted against moonlit clouds. He closed to 400 yards, confirmed identification, and opened fire. The transport's starboard engine exploded in orange flame. The aircraft rolled right and began spiraling downward, trailing smoke and burning fuel. Harper watched it impact the water, where it disappeared beneath the waves in a brief surge of white foam that glowed in the moonlight, and then vanished. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds. From initial detection to destroyed target, 17 minutes. It was, Harper realized, exactly what Fighter Command had been trying to achieve for months: rapid, reliable intercepts based on accurate intelligence. The radio monitoring had transformed night fighting from a game of chance into something approaching a science. Other crews reported similar successes. By the end of the patrol period, the 12-aircraft mission had achieved 7 confirmed kills and 3 damaged aircraft, more victories in a single night than the squadron had achieved in the previous 6 weeks combined. The after-action reports read like a vindication of everything Harper and Reeves had argued for. Evidence so compelling that even the most skeptical pilots had to acknowledge that something fundamental had shifted in their favor. When Harper and Reeves landed just after 3 a.m., they found Pettigrew waiting in operations, studying a wall chart where colored pins marked each intercept location. The wing commander looked up as they entered, his expression thoughtful. "Flight Lieutenant, your radio operator method just achieved a 70% intercept success rate." 70%. Do you understand what that means? "Yes, sir," Harper said carefully. "It means that if we can sustain this rate, we can effectively shut down German transport operations in this theater within a month. It means the Balkans garrisons will face critical supply shortages. It means we've found a genuine operational advantage." Pettigrew paused, then added quietly, "It also means you were right to hold fire 3 nights ago. If you'd shot down those transports and tipped off the Germans, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Harper felt relief and exhaustion in equal measure. "Thank you, sir." Pettigrew returned his attention to the chart. "Group Captain Thornley is already drafting reports for Air Ministry. There's talk of expanding this across multiple theaters, perhaps even establishing a dedicated signals intelligence unit focused specifically on transport interdiction. But that's above our level. For now, our job is to keep hunting, keep listening, and keep destroying every German transport we can find before they realize what's happening." Over the following week, the operation expanded exponentially. More squadrons integrated radio monitoring. More operators were trained. Equipment was modified and improved based on operational experience. Intelligence officers began compiling comprehensive data on German transport routes, schedules, frequencies, and communication protocols. A picture emerged of an enemy logistics network that was more extensive and more vulnerable than anyone had realized. The Germans were moving hundreds of tons of supplies every week across the Adriatic, Aegean, and Ionian seas. Their transport fleet consisted of several dozen Ju-52s, supplemented by captured Italian aircraft and impressed civilian planes. They flew almost exclusively at night, relying on low altitude and radio silence to avoid detection. Except they weren't maintaining radio silence, not completely. The civilian backup radios they used for coordination and emergency communication were creating an electromagnetic trail that British night fighters could follow with devastating effectiveness. By September 25th, 1 week after Thornley's authorization, Allied night fighters in the Mediterranean had destroyed or damaged 43 German transport aircraft. The success rate had actually increased as operators gained experience and techniques were refined. German transport losses approached 60% on some routes, an attrition rate that couldn't be sustained. Intelligence reports indicated growing confusion within German Transport Command. They knew something had changed, knew their aircraft were being intercepted at rates that exceeded statistical probability, but they couldn't identify the cause. Harper flew mission after mission, each one following the same pattern: takeoff, patrol to assigned area, Reeves scanning frequencies, detection, intercept, engagement, return to base. The routine became almost mechanical, though Harper never allowed himself to become complacent. Each transport carried men, enemy soldiers, yes, but still human beings, who died when his cannons found their targets, who fell burning into dark water or crashed into mountains with the same terrified finality regardless of their nationality. He tried not to think about the German crew he'd heard praying on that first intercept, tried not to imagine their faces or their families or their last thoughts as their aircraft disintegrated around them. War required compartmentalization, the ability to destroy without dwelling on destruction, to kill without personalizing those killed. Harper was good at that compartmentalization during missions, but afterward, lying in his cot in the officers' quarters, listening to other pilots snore or mutter in their sleep, he sometimes heard those German voices praying and wondered if they'd known, somehow, that their prayers were being overheard, that their words were guiding death toward them. Reeves never spoke about what he heard during intercepts, the conversations, the fears, the mundane human details that preceded annihilation. He maintained professional detachment, recording data, taking bearings, directing interceptions with clinical precision. But Harper noticed that Reeves had stopped eating much, had lost weight, had developed dark circles under his eyes that suggested sleep was becoming elusive. The work they were doing was effective. It was also intimate in a way that normal combat wasn't. They weren't just fighting an abstract enemy, they were listening to individual human beings in the moments before they died. On September 27th, Harper and Reeves were summoned to another meeting with Thornley, who had returned to the base to assess the operation's progress. This time, the group captain's demeanor was less evaluative, more decisive. He got straight to the point. Gentlemen, in 10 days you've helped achieve more transport interdiction success than we managed in the previous 3 months. Air Ministry is impressed. They're also concerned that we're running out of time. German intelligence isn't stupid. They're investigating these losses. We estimate they'll identify the communications vulnerability within 2 weeks, possibly sooner. When that happens, they'll modify procedures and our advantage disappears. What are our orders, sir? Harper asked. Maximum pressure. Every available night fighter equipped for radio intercept will fly continuous operations until either the German transport fleet is destroyed or they stop using compromised frequencies. We're also coordinating with Bomber Command to strike German transport bases, destroy aircraft on the ground while we destroy them in the air. The objective is to make German logistics in the Mediterranean unsustainable. Thornley spread a map across the table. Intelligence has identified 5 primary German transport bases in Italy and Greece. They're also running supply flights from southern France. We're going to hit all of them simultaneously. Bombing raids on the bases, fighter patrols on the routes, comprehensive interdiction. If we execute this correctly, we can effectively eliminate German air transport capacity in this theater, within a fortnight. Harper studied the map, recognizing many of the locations he'd tracked German aircraft toward over recent missions. "Sir, if we hit this hard, the Germans will definitely realize something specific has compromised their operations." Agreed. "But by the time they identify and fix the problem, we'll have already inflicted irreparable damage." "That's acceptable." Thornley's expression was grim. "Gentlemen, this is total war. We exploit every advantage until the enemy adapts, then we find new advantages. You've given us this one. Now we use it before it's gone." The operation began on the night of September 29th, with a coordination that demonstrated how thoroughly the initial discovery had been integrated into broader Allied strategy. At 21 hours, RAF Lancaster bombers struck 3 German transport bases in southern Italy, cratering runways and destroying parked aircraft with a precision that suggested excellent intelligence about where targets would be concentrated. Simultaneously, American B-24 Liberators attacked facilities in Greece, targeting hangars and fuel storage with incendiary bombs that turned night into artificial day. And across the entire Mediterranean theater, 36 night fighters equipped with radio intercept capability took to the air, forming an invisible net designed to catch any German transport that attempted to fly through the chaos. Harper launched from the Italian airfield at 22:30, with Reeves in the rear seat and a sense that this mission carried unusual weight. The air felt electric with significance, the culmination of 2 weeks of effort, the validation of a method that had transformed from experimental hypothesis into operational doctrine. Below, the Mediterranean stretched dark and vast, its surface occasionally reflecting starlight in patches that looked like scattered silver coins. Above, the sky was clear, visibility unlimited, a hunter's night. Reeves began scanning frequencies immediately, working through the designated bands with practiced efficiency. The radio spectrum was noisier than usual tonight, multiple transmissions overlapping, German voices sounding stressed, confused, urgency replacing the casual conversational tone that had characterized earlier intercepts. Harper could hear fragments through his own headset as Reeves cycled through channels. Damage reports, requests for permission to abort missions, arguments about alternate landing sites. "They're panicking," Reeves said quietly. "I'm picking up at least a dozen different transmissions. The bomber raids have disrupted their entire operation. Transport crews are trying to find places to land, but their primary bases are either destroyed or under attack." "Can you isolate specific targets?" Harper asked. Reeves adjusted his equipment, fine-tuning reception. "There's a strong signal at bearing 095, maybe 20 miles. Sounds like a 3-aircraft formation discussing whether to continue to their original destination or divert to an alternate field. They're low on fuel, arguing about options." Harper turned toward the indicated bearing and increased speed. The Beaufighter's engines responded with their characteristic throaty roar, pressing him back slightly into his seat. He climbed to 12,000 feet, gaining altitude advantage while Reeves continued monitoring. The German conversation grew more heated, one pilot advocating for immediate landing at any available field, another insisting they had enough fuel to reach a coastal airstrip, a third suggesting they turn back entirely. "They're breaking formation," Reeves reported. "One aircraft is descending. I think he's decided to land immediately, wherever he can find a clear field." Harper scanned the darkness ahead and below. The moon was nearly new tonight, providing almost no natural illumination, which made visual detection extremely difficult. But radar showed 3 contacts at approximately the right distance and bearing, solid returns that suggested large, slow-moving aircraft. Harper selected the nearest contact and began his intercept, descending gradually, positioning himself for an approach from behind and slightly below, where German rear gunners, if these transports were even armed, would have difficulty spotting him. At 8,000 feet, he achieved visual contact. The transport was unmistakably a Ju-52, its corrugated skin visible as a slightly lighter shade of black against the darkness, its 3 engines producing faint exhaust glows that marked its position. It was flying straight and level at approximately 4,000 feet, apparently committed to whatever destination its pilot had chosen. Harper closed to 600 yards, confirming identification, then advanced throttles and climbed slightly to position himself for a diving attack. The engagement was brief and conclusive. Harper opened fire at 400 yards, his 4 cannons and 6 machine guns converging on the transport's fuselage and wings. Tracers arced through darkness, bright orange streaks that connected the Beaufighter to its target like deadly threads. The Ju-52 absorbed the fire for perhaps 2 seconds before its left engine exploded, tearing away from the wing mount and tumbling earthward trailing flame. The transport rolled violently left, its remaining engines unable to compensate for the asymmetric thrust. Harper broke right to avoid collision, watching as the German aircraft entered an uncontrollable spin, rotating faster with each revolution until it impacted the sea in a geyser of white water that rose briefly and then subsided. "One down," Harper said. Already scanning for the next target, Reeves was monitoring the remaining German transmissions. The other 2 aircraft are separating. One is continuing east. The other is turning back west. Both pilots sound terrified. They just heard the lead aircraft go silent. Harper made a quick calculation. Fuel was sufficient to pursue one target, probably not both. "Give me a bearing on the eastbound aircraft. Bearing 110, estimated 15 miles. Descending through 3,000 feet, Harper turned to intercept, pushing the Beaufighter to maximum cruise speed. Reeves continued listening to the German radio traffic, which had become increasingly frantic. Other RAF fighters were achieving their own intercepts across the theater. German pilots were reporting attacks, calling for help, broadcasting Mayday signals that went unanswered because their bases were either destroyed or overwhelmed. The entire German transport network was collapsing in real time, and the evidence was audible in the voices of men who had taken off expecting routine logistics missions and were now facing systematic annihilation. Harper found the second transport at 3,000 feet, heading toward what might have been the emergency landing site along the Greek coast. This aircraft was flying faster than the previous one, its pilot clearly aware that danger surrounded him and desperate to reach safety. But speed couldn't save a Ju-52 from a Beaufighter. Harper closed from astern, positioned himself carefully, and fired a 3-second burst that walked rounds from the transport's tail forward through the fuselage. The German aircraft shuddered, its rear section disintegrating under the impact of cannon shells. It nosed down sharply and entered a steep dive that ended in a mountainside explosion visible as a brief orange flash against dark terrain. "2 down," Harper said, his voice flat with the emotional neutrality that came from reducing human beings to tactical statistics. Reeves removed his headphones for a moment, rubbing his eyes. His face in the dim instrument light looked drawn, older than his 26 years. "The German radio traffic is decreasing. I think they're realizing that broadcasting is somehow compromising them. Some pilots have stopped talking entirely." "Too late," Harper said. They continued patrol for another 90 minutes, during which Reeves detected 4 additional German transmissions. 2 led to successful intercepts, one by Harper, one by another RAF fighter that Harper directed to the target. The other 2 signals faded before intercepts could be achieved, suggesting the German aircraft had either landed or deliberately shut down their radios. By the time Harper turned back toward base, he had personally destroyed 4 transports and assisted in the destruction of 1 more, a single night's work that equaled many pilots' entire combat careers. Landing at 2:45, Harper found the airfield bustling with activity despite the pre-dawn hour. Aircraft were being refueled and rearmed as quickly as ground crews could work. Pilots stood in groups comparing notes, voices animated with the particular energy that came from successful missions. Intelligence officers moved between groups with clipboards, collecting data, updating maps. compiling statistics that would eventually become official reports describing this night's operations. Pettigrew emerged from operations and approached Harper as he climbed down from the Beaufighter.
4 confirmed, 1 assist?
Yes, sir. That brings the night's total to 57 confirmed destroyed transports across the theater. 57 in one night. Pettigrew shook his head, something like awe in his expression. The Germans have effectively lost their entire Mediterranean transport fleet. Whatever survives tonight will be grounded by tomorrow because they have nowhere safe to operate from. Harper felt the weight of that number. 57 aircraft. Assuming average crews of 4 per transport, that was more than 200 men killed. In a single night, an entire battalion's worth of deaths, resulting from radio intercepts that had begun. With one curious observation about prayers being broadcast on an unexpected frequency. The mathematical relationship between initial discovery and final consequences seemed almost unreal in its proportions. Reeves joined them, carrying his log of radio intercepts. He looked exhausted, his uniform soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. Pettigrew glanced at the logs, then at Reeves. How many German transmissions did you monitor tonight? 17 separate broadcasts, sir. 12 led to successful intercepts. The last 5, the Germans seemed to realize something was wrong. Pilots started maintaining radio silence even when it compromised their ability to coordinate or request assistance. They figured it out, Pettigrew said. Too late to save tonight's operations, but they've identified that radio communications are somehow compromising them, which means our advantage is finished. Not quite finished, sir, Harper said. They know radio is involved, but they may not know specifically how. If they think we're using radio direction finding against their military frequencies, they might modify military radio procedures while continuing to use civilian backup systems. We could potentially exploit this for several more days before they close the vulnerability completely. Pettigrew considered this, then shook his head. Fighter Command's position is that we've extracted maximum value from this method. Continuing operations risks German intelligence obtaining enough data to understand exactly what we were doing, which could compromise similar intelligence methods in other theaters. We're being ordered to cease radio intercept operations, effective immediately, and return to standard radar-based patrols. Harper wanted to argue, but recognized the logic. Intelligence advantages were temporary by nature. You exploited them intensively, extracted maximum value, then protected the methodology by ceasing operations before the enemy could fully understand and counter what you'd done. If the Germans never learned specifically that their civilian backup radios had been monitored, they might continue similar practices elsewhere, where other Allied units could exploit the same vulnerability. Understood. Sir, Harper said. The following days brought confirmation of what the September 29th operation had achieved. German transport operations in the Mediterranean effectively ceased. The Balkans garrisons began experiencing critical supply shortages. Wehrmacht units in Greece and Yugoslavia found themselves cut off from resupply, forced to rely on naval transport that was slower, more vulnerable to Allied naval interdiction, and insufficient to meet operational requirements. The impact rippled through German strategic planning. Forces that had been sustained by air logistics suddenly became liabilities, tying down troops and resources in untenable positions. Intelligence reports indicated growing chaos within German Transport Command. The September 29th disaster had destroyed or damaged more than half their available aircraft in the theater. The survivors were grounded because their bases had been bombed into unusability. New aircraft and crews were diverted from other theaters, but they arrived to find an operational environment that had fundamentally shifted. Allied night fighters were achieving intercept, rates that made routine transport missions suicidal. What the Germans never fully understood was how the Allied success had been achieved. Their post-operation analyses focused on radar improvements, better pilot training, increased fighter deployment. Some intelligence officers suspected signals intelligence might be involved, but without knowing specifically what had been compromised. German Transport Command implemented broad communication security measures that addressed military frequencies while overlooking the civilian. Backup radios that had actually betrayed them. Harper flew standard patrols for the next 3 weeks, achieving occasional radar-based intercepts, but nothing approaching the success rates of late September. The war continued, missions flown, targets engaged, reports filed. The German transport crisis gradually stabilized as they adapted to the new operational environment, though they never regained the logistics capacity they'd possessed before their communications were compromised. On October 21st, Harper was summoned to Wing Commander Pettigrew's office and found Group Captain Thornley there as well. Both officers stood as he entered, which was unusual, and immediately suggested that something significant was happening. Thornley gestured toward a chair. "Sit down, Flight Lieutenant. We have news from Air Ministry." Harper sat, uncertain what to expect. Thornley opened a folder and removed a single sheet of paper. "You're being awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for exceptional skill and initiative in developing new night intercept techniques that significantly impacted enemy transport operations. Additionally, you're being promoted to Squadron Leader and assigned to Fighter Command's Tactics Development Unit. They want you to help implement radio intercept methods across other theaters and train new crews in the techniques you pioneered." Harper absorbed this information with mixed feelings. Recognition was gratifying, but he'd grown attached to his squadron, to the routine of operational flying, to the partnership he'd developed with Reeves. "What about Malcolm Reeves, sir?" "He's being awarded the Distinguished Flying Medal and transferred to Signals Intelligence Command. They're establishing a specialized unit focused on monitoring enemy aviation communications, and they want experienced operators who understand how to integrate signals intelligence with combat operations." Thornley paused, then added, "You both did exceptional work. What started as one curious intercept became an operation that destroyed a significant portion of enemy logistics capacity. That's not a small achievement." Harper thought about the German voices he'd heard praying, about the men whose deaths had followed from radio transmissions they never knew were being monitored, about the strange intimacy of killing people whose fears and hopes you'd overheard minutes before pulling the trigger. "Sir, permission to ask a question?" "Go ahead. How many total German transport aircraft did we destroy using radio intercept methods?" Thornley consulted his folder. From September 14th through September 30th, Allied night fighters achieved 93 confirmed transport kills in the Mediterranean theater. Analysis indicates approximately 80% of those intercepts were enabled by signals intelligence derived from your monitoring methodology. So roughly 74 aircraft directly attributable to your discovery. 74 aircraft, perhaps 300 men. An entire transport wing eliminated because they'd been preying on frequencies someone was listening to. Harper felt the weight of those numbers settling onto him like physical mass, knowing he would carry them forward regardless of medals or promotions or new assignments. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. After the meeting, Harper found Reeves in the radio section, packing his equipment for transfer. They stood together in uncomfortable silence for a moment before Reeves spoke. "I've been thinking about that first night, the German crew praying. I wonder if they made it home, or if we killed them on a subsequent mission. Does it matter?" Harper asked. "I suppose not. Dead is dead, regardless of which night it happened." Reeves closed his equipment case and latched it. "I keep replaying what we heard. Not just the prayers, but all of it. The casual conversations, the complaints about weather, the mundane human details. We heard them living, and then we killed them. That's different from normal combat, isn't it? More personal somehow." Harper nodded. "Yes, more personal. Do you think what we did was right?" Reeves asked. "Ethically, I mean. Not tactically or strategically, but morally." Harper considered the question carefully. "We're at war. They were enemy combatants supporting military operations. Interdicting their logistics is legitimate warfare. But you're asking something deeper, whether there's something morally problematic about using their prayers against them, about exploiting vulnerability they created through devotion rather than negligence. Exactly. I don't have a good answer, Harper admitted. Maybe there isn't one. War makes murderers of us all, and we dress it up with terms like combat and enemy casualties and strategic necessity. What we did was effective. Whether it was right, he trailed off, shaking his head. Reeves picked up his case. I suppose we'll have time to think about it. Years probably. Maybe the rest of our lives. They shook hands, the gesture formal but carrying genuine respect and something like shared grief for the work they'd done together. Then Reeves left, heading toward a staff car that would take him to his new assignment, and Harper walked back across the airfield toward his quarters, past aircraft being prepared for that night's missions, past crews who would hunt and kill and return to file reports that reduced human complexity to tactical statistics. That night, Harper didn't fly. He sat in the officers' mess, drinking tea that had grown cold, thinking about prayers and radio frequencies and the strange paths that led from curiosity to killing. The pilots around him discussed missions and aircraft and the war with the easy camaraderie of men who shared dangerous work. Harper listened but didn't participate, his thoughts elsewhere. With German crews falling from dark skies, with voices silenced mid-prayer, with the invisible electromagnetic traces that had guided death toward men who never knew they were being overheard. The winter of 1943 brought cold rain to the Italian airfield and a different kind of warfare to squadron leader David Harper's daily routine. His new assignment with Fighter Command's Tactics Development Unit meant fewer flying hours and more time in briefing rooms, teaching other pilots and radio operators the intercept methods that had proved so effective during September's operations. He traveled between bases, delivering lectures, supervising training exercises, reviewing reports from squadrons attempting to replicate the Mediterranean success in other theaters. The work was important and necessary, but Harper felt the loss of operational flying like a phantom limb, something gone but still somehow present, aching in its absence. The radio intercept method spread across RAF night fighter operations with varying degrees of success. In some theaters, German forces had modified their communications procedures after the Mediterranean disasters, making systematic monitoring less effective. In others, particularly over the North Sea and Bay of Biscay, similar vulnerabilities emerged where German crews used civilian frequencies for coordination, believing themselves invisible when they were actually broadcasting their positions. The technique became one tool among many, not a miracle solution, but a valid approach that skilled operators could exploit when conditions permitted. Harper heard occasional updates about Malcolm Reeves, who had become something of a legend within Signals Intelligence Command. Reeves had developed sophisticated monitoring protocols and training programs that transformed radio intercept from experimental technique into systematic intelligence collection. His work extended beyond aviation, monitoring enemy naval communications, tracking convoy movements, identifying command posts through electromagnetic emissions. The BBC sound engineer, who had noticed German prayers on an unexpected frequency, had found his true calling in the invisible world of signals intelligence. In January 1944, Harper was summoned to Air Ministry in London for what he was told would be a comprehensive debrief regarding Mediterranean transport interdiction operations. He travelled by train through a England grey with winter, arriving at the imposing headquarters building where strategic decisions were made and wars were planned by men who rarely saw combat but whose choices determined the fates of men who did. He was directed to a conference room where 3 senior officers waited, along with 2 civilians whose presence suggested intelligence services rather than military command. The senior officer, an Air Vice Marshal named Radcliffe, opened the meeting with characteristic British directness. Squadron Leader Harper, we've completed our analysis of Operation Silencer. That's the designation we've retrospectively applied to the Mediterranean transport interdiction campaign you initiated. The results are remarkable. From mid-September through October 1943, German air transport capacity in the Mediterranean theater was reduced by 78%. Balkan's garrison effectiveness decreased measurably due to supply shortages. Wehrmacht operations in Greece and Yugoslavia were significantly disrupted, and all of this stemmed from one flight lieutenant noticing that German crews were broadcasting prayers on civilian radio frequencies. Harper nodded, uncertain what response was expected. Radcliffe continued, "What makes this particularly interesting, from an intelligence perspective, is that we don't believe the Germans ever fully understood what compromised their operations. Their post-incident investigations focused on radar and patrol patterns. They implemented new communication security measures for military frequencies, but apparently never identified that their civilian backup radios were the actual vulnerability, which means similar tactics might still be exploitable in other contexts." One of the civilians spoke up, his accent suggesting educated Scotland. "Squadron Leader, I'm Crawford from Special Operations. We're interested in understanding the psychological aspects of what you observed. You reported that the initial intercept involved German crew members reciting the Rosary. Can you describe what you remember about that specific transmission?" Harper thought back to that September night, to the voices emerging from static, to the cadence of Latin phrases mixed with German. The transmission was clear enough to distinguish individual voices. I counted at least 4 men speaking in unison, suggesting most or all of the crew were participating. The tone was solemn but not panicked, religious devotion rather than desperate prayer. They were reciting the sorrowful mysteries, which deals with Christ's suffering. It seemed significant that they chose that particular meditation while flying through enemy airspace. "Did you get the sense they knew they were being monitored?" Crawford asked. "No, the transmission had the quality of private prayer, not broadcast communication. I believe their radio was malfunctioning or had been accidentally left in transmit mode. They had no idea anyone was listening." Crawford exchanged glances with the other civilian, then turned back to Harper. "We've been analyzing intercepted German communications from multiple theaters, looking for patterns. What we've found is that German aircrew, particularly transport and reconnaissance units, frequently engage in religious observance during missions. It's more common than comparable behavior among British crews. The Germans integrate prayer into operational routine in ways that create potential intelligence vulnerabilities." "You're suggesting this wasn't an isolated incident?" Harper asked. "Correct. We believe German military culture, particularly in aviation units, incorporates religious practice more systematically than our own forces do, which creates opportunities for signals intelligence if we know how to exploit them." Crawford pulled out a folder containing what appeared to be transcripts. "Since September, we've identified 17 separate instances where German crews broadcast prayers, psalms, or other religious content on unsecured frequencies. Most were brief, a few seconds before someone realized the channel was open. But the pattern exists." Radcliffe leaned forward. "Squadron Leader, we need your assessment. Based on your experience, could this phenomenon be systematically exploited? Could we develop protocols for monitoring religious broadcasts as a form of intelligence collection?" Harper felt deeply uncomfortable with the question's implications. Using enemy prayers for intelligence purposes had been a tactical accident, an opportunistic exploit of a genuine operational error. Systematizing it, turning it into deliberate intelligence doctrine, felt like crossing a line he couldn't quite articulate, but instinctively recognized. "Sir, with respect, I'm not certain that's wise. What we did in September was exploit a specific vulnerability, crews using civilian radios inappropriately. If we start treating religious observance as an intelligence target, we risk. I'm not sure how to phrase this diplomatically. Speak freely," Radcliffe said. "We risk losing moral high ground, sir. The Germans are enemy combatants, yes, but their prayers are fundamentally personal expressions of faith. Using those prayers as targeting information feels exploitative in ways that normal signals intelligence doesn't. And practically, if word got out that we were deliberately monitoring and weaponizing enemy religious practices, the propaganda implications could be significant, both for enemy morale and for our own public perception. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the second civilian spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a Welsh lilt. "I'm Davies, also Special Operations. Squadron Leader, your ethical concerns are noted, and actually rather refreshing. Most military officers don't raise moral objections to effective intelligence methods. But consider this. German transport operations you interdicted were carrying supplies to Wehrmacht units engaged in brutal occupation duties. Those supplies enabled continued military action that included reprisals against civilian populations. By disrupting those logistics, you arguably saved lives, potentially including civilians who would have been victims of German military operations. Does the method by which you achieved that disruption negate the positive outcome?" Harper considered the argument carefully. It was true that interdicting enemy logistics had strategic value beyond simple kill counts. German forces in the Balkans had committed atrocities, reprisal killings, deportations, anti-partisan operations that targeted civilian populations. Reducing their capacity to operate effectively had humanitarian implications. But the logic troubled him. "Sir, that reasoning could justify almost anything if we weight outcomes heavily enough. The question isn't whether interdicting German logistics was justified. Obviously it was. The question is whether there are methods we shouldn't employ even when they're effective. And you believe monitoring enemy prayers crosses that threshold?" Davies asked. "I believe it approaches that threshold closely enough that we should be cautious," Harper said. "What we did in September was reactive. We heard something unexpected and used it tactically. Building systematic intelligence protocols around religious monitoring feels like something different. More deliberate, more invasive, perhaps." Radcliffe made notes on a pad in front of him, his expression thoughtful. "Your concerns are recorded. However, I should inform you that Air Ministry's position is that any electromagnetic emission from enemy forces constitutes legitimate intelligence material, regardless of content. If German crews choose to broadcast prayers on unsecured frequencies, monitoring those transmissions is no different from monitoring any other communication. The information is being voluntarily transmitted into the public electromagnetic spectrum, where anyone with appropriate equipment can receive it." Harper recognized this as the official position he was being instructed to accept. He nodded slowly. "Understood, sir. That said," Radcliffe continued, "your point about operational security and propaganda implications is well taken. We'll be careful about how this intelligence method is documented and discussed. Official reports will refer to unsecured civilian frequency monitoring, rather than specifically mentioning religious content. If questioned, the explanation is that we were detecting inadvertent transmissions on non-military bands, which is technically accurate without being complete." The meeting continued for another hour, covering technical details about radio equipment, training protocols, and recommendations for expanding signals intelligence capabilities. Harper answered questions mechanically, his thoughts elsewhere, wrestling with the implications of what his initial discovery had become. He'd noticed something curious during a routine patrol, investigated it, and turned it into an effective tactical innovation. That should have been a straightforward success story. Instead, it had opened complicated questions about the boundaries of acceptable warfare, about whether some types of intelligence collection crossed ethical lines even when they were technically legal and operationally effective. When the meeting finally concluded, Harper was dismissed with instructions to return to his duties and to remain available for future consultations regarding signals intelligence applications. He left Air Ministry and walked through London's cold streets, past buildings damaged by German bombing. Past people going about their wartime routines with the particular determination that characterized British civilian life under threat. The city felt tired, worn down by years of war, but fundamentally resilient, continuing to function, to resist, to endure. Harper found himself at a small Catholic church near Victoria Station, its stone facade pocked with shrapnel scars from a nearby bomb strike. He hadn't attended services regularly since the war began. Operational schedules made religious observance difficult, and something about combat flying had complicated his relationship with faith in ways he didn't fully understand. But he entered the church now, found it empty except for an elderly woman lighting candles near the altar, and sat in a rear pew. The silence was profound after the noise of London streets. Light filtered through stained glass windows depicting saints and biblical scenes, casting colored patterns across wooden pews worn smooth by generations of worshippers. Harper sat quietly, not praying exactly, but thinking about prayers. His own childhood prayers before bed, the prayers of German crews he'd heard and then killed, the strange intersection of devotion and violence that war created. He remembered something his father had told him years ago, when Harper was perhaps 10 years old and struggling with the concept of just war. His father, a veteran of the Great War who rarely spoke about his experiences, had said, "The hard thing about war isn't determining whether your cause is just. Most nations convince themselves their cause is just. The hard thing is maintaining your humanity while doing inhuman things. You'll have to make choices where every option is terrible, and the best you can do is choose the least terrible option, and then live with that choice. That's not heroism. It's just survival, moral survival as much as physical survival." Harper hadn't fully understood at the time. Now he did. What he'd done in September, using overheard prayers to locate and destroy enemy aircraft, was operationally justified, strategically effective and arguably moral within the framework of legitimate warfare. But it was also troubling in ways that transcended simple categorization. He had killed men whose faith he'd overheard, whose fear and hope had been audible in their voices moments before his cannons found them. That intimacy was different from the abstract violence of aerial combat, where enemies were usually just radar contacts or distant silhouettes. The elderly woman finished lighting her candles and left quietly, leaving Harper alone in the church. He sat for perhaps 20 minutes more, then stood and walked back out into London's cold afternoon. He had duties to perform, crews to train, reports to review. The war continued regardless of his moral complications, and his job was to contribute to Allied victory through whatever means were effective and authorized. Ethical ambiguity was the price of participation. Over the following months, Harper continued his work with tactics development, traveling between bases, teaching intercept methods, evaluating new equipment and procedures. He heard occasional reports about successful radio intercepts in various theaters, a German reconnaissance flight detected over Norway through inadvertent broadcast, a transport formation located near Denmark through similar means. Scattered successes that vindicated the methodology without approaching the systematic effectiveness of September's Mediterranean operations. In June 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy created new priorities and new operational contexts. Harper was temporarily reassigned to support tactical air operations over France, where the immediate challenges of supporting ground forces took precedence over experimental intelligence methods. The war's momentum had shifted, no longer primarily defensive, no longer focused on attrition, but increasingly about offensive operations aimed at final victory. Harper flew combat missions again, enjoying the return to operational flying despite the increased danger. Over Normandy, German flak was intense, and Luftwaffe fighters, though numerically inferior, fought with desperate skill. He lost friends, saw aircraft destroyed, attended memorials for crews who didn't return. The intimate horror of combat flying returned, not the psychological complexity of overheard prayers, But the immediate physical terror of being shot at, of watching wingmen explode, of surviving through skill and luck in roughly equal measure. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Harper was at a base in Belgium when the announcement came, and the celebration was muted, relief more than joy, exhaustion more than triumph. Too many friends were dead. Too many cities were destroyed. Victory was necessary, but came with a cost that would take generations to fully comprehend. In the months that followed, as military forces demobilized and Britain transitioned back toward peacetime, Harper was approached by intelligence services about remaining in signals intelligence work. The offer was attractive: stability, interesting technical challenges, work that mattered in the emerging Cold War context. But Harper declined. He'd had enough of listening to enemies, enough of the invisible intimacies that electronic warfare created. He wanted something simpler, more direct, less morally complicated. He returned to civilian aviation, becoming a flight instructor at a small aerodrome in Yorkshire. The work was peaceful, teaching students basic flying skills, watching nervous beginners gradually develop confidence, helping young pilots discover the joy of flight without the horror of combat. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, and when asked, he described them in the vague generalizations that veterans use to avoid explaining what couldn't be explained to people who hadn't experienced it. In 1952, 7 years after the war's end, Harper received a letter from Malcolm Reeves. They'd lost contact during the post-war chaos, pursued different careers, returned to different versions of normal life. Reeves's letter was brief, but carried significance. I've been thinking about September 1943, about what we heard and what we did. I don't have profound conclusions, but I wanted you to know that I've made peace with it. We were in a war. We used available intelligence. Men died, but the alternative was that other men would die, potentially more of them, including people on our side. That's not moral certainty, but it's moral adequacy. I hope you've reached similar peace. Your friend, Malcolm. Harper read the letter several times, sitting in his small office at the aerodrome, while students practiced touch-and-go landings outside. Moral adequacy. It was a good phrase, not claiming righteousness, but acknowledging the limited options available in impossible circumstances. Harper wrote back, and they began corresponding irregularly, letters exchanged every few months discussing life, family, work, everything except the war, until occasionally they couldn't avoid it, and wrote carefully about what they'd experienced and how they'd tried to integrate it into post-war existence. In 1958, Harper was contacted by an RAF historian compiling a classified history of signals intelligence operations during World War II. The historian wanted to interview Harper about Operation Silencer, to document the Mediterranean transport interdiction campaign for future military analysts. Harper agreed and spent 2 days in London being questioned about frequencies and procedures and tactical decisions. What do you consider the most significant aspect of this operation? The historian asked near the end of the interview. Harper thought carefully before answering. The most significant aspect was that it demonstrated how small observations by junior personnel can have strategic impact if institutions are willing to listen. I was a flight lieutenant when I noticed German prayers on an unexpected frequency. I could have dismissed it as irrelevant or reported it through channels that would have buried it in bureaucracy. Instead, I acted on it. My commanding officer supported that action, and higher command authorized expansion when evidence supported the method. That openness to innovation from unexpected sources is rare in military organizations, but it's essential for adaptation. And ethically, the historian pressed, "Do you believe the operation was justified?" "I believe it was within the boundaries of legitimate warfare," Harper said carefully. "Whether it was optimal from an ethical standpoint is a different question, one I'm not fully qualified to answer. We used intelligence that enemy forces inadvertently provided. Men died as a result. That's true of virtually every military operation. What makes this case unusual is the specific content we monitored: prayers, personal expressions of faith. That creates discomfort that simple tactical intelligence doesn't. But discomfort doesn't necessarily mean wrongdoing. The historian made notes, nodded, and moved on to other questions. When the interview concluded, Harper left feeling that he'd failed to adequately convey the complexity of what he'd experienced. The strange combination of tactical satisfaction and moral unease. The sense that something important had been achieved through methods that resisted simple ethical categorization. By the 1960s, Harper had become a senior flight instructor, training commercial pilots for the expanding civilian aviation industry. He was respected for his technical skill and his patience with students, known as someone who could teach even nervous pilots to handle difficult situations calmly. His wartime service was public record, but not something he emphasized. A brief mention in his professional biography, occasionally referenced by students curious about their instructor's background, but generally treated as history rather than current identity. In 1967, Malcolm Reeves visited the aerodrome where Harper taught. They hadn't seen each other in more than 20 years, and age had changed both men. Graying hair, lined faces, bodies less resilient than wartime youth. But they recognized each other immediately, and spent an afternoon walking the aerodrome grounds, watching students fly, talking about everything and nothing. Eventually, conversation turned to September 1943. "Do you remember their voices?" Reeves asked quietly. "The German crew praying?" "Yes," Harper said. "I remember." "I've tried to forget," Reeves admitted. "For years I tried to forget, but recently I've realized that forgetting would be wrong somehow. Those men deserve to be remembered, even by the people who killed them, maybe especially by us." Harper understood what Reeves meant. The German crews whose transmissions they'd monitored weren't abstractions. They were human beings who'd lived and died, who'd prayed and hoped and feared, who'd been someone's sons and brothers and perhaps fathers. Forgetting them, reducing them to statistics, seemed like a final violence added to their deaths. "I think about what we would want," Harper said, "if positions were reversed. If we were German crews being hunted through Mediterranean darkness, if we were praying for safety and being overheard by British fighters, what would we want from the men who killed us? Not forgiveness necessarily. What we did wasn't wrong within the context of war, but maybe acknowledgement. Recognition that our deaths mattered, that we were human, that the men who killed us carried some awareness of what they'd done." "That's all we can offer," Reeves said. Acknowledgement, memory, refusal to pretend it was simpler than it was. They stood together in silence, watching a student pilot practice stall recoveries overhead. The small aircraft climbing and descending in controlled exercises that bore no resemblance to combat flying, but used the same fundamental skills. The afternoon sun angled across the Yorkshire landscape, casting long shadows, painting the world in shades of gold and amber that suggested beauty despite everything, despite war, despite death, despite the complicated moral landscape that survivors navigated. Harper never received recognition beyond the medals awarded in 1943. He was never promoted past squadron leader, never commanded large units, never achieved fame or historical prominence. Official histories of World War II mentioned Operation Silencer briefly, if at all, usually in technical discussions of signals intelligence without emphasizing the human details, the prayers, the voices, the intimate violence of killing men whose faith you'd overheard. He died in 1983 at age 67 of heart failure following routine surgery. His obituary in local newspapers mentioned his distinguished Flying Cross and his career as a flight instructor, but didn't detail the September 1943 operations that he'd considered his most significant contribution to the war effort. Malcolm Reeves attended the funeral, as did several former students and fellow instructors, and they stood together in a Yorkshire churchyard while a minister spoke about service and sacrifice and the debt owed to men who'd done difficult things in difficult times. What Harper had discovered, that German transport crews were broadcasting on civilian frequencies, that faith could become an inadvertent intelligence source, that small observations could have strategic consequences, remained relevant long after his death. Modern signals intelligence continued evolving, finding new ways to monitor electromagnetic emissions, to exploit enemy communications, to turn information into operational advantage. The specific techniques changed, but the fundamental principle endured. Armies that broadcast reveal themselves to enemies who listen. But Harper's deeper discovery, that some intelligence methods create moral complications transcending simple categorization, that effectiveness doesn't automatically confer ethical justification, that warriors carry the weight of their specific actions, regardless of whether those actions were legal or strategically sound. That discovery was more personal, less transferable to doctrine or training manuals. It was something each person involved in violence had to navigate individually, finding whatever accommodation between duty and conscience allowed them to function. The German crews whose prayers Harper heard never knew they'd been overheard. They died believing their faith was private, that their appeals to God remained between themselves and whatever divine presence they imagined. Whether Harper's exploitation of those prayers was justified remains a question without definitive answer, debatable by philosophers and theologians and historians, but ultimately unresolvable because war creates situations where every choice carries moral cost and the best available option is still terrible. What remains certain is that in September 1943, a junior RAF officer noticed something others had missed, acted on that observation with intelligence and courage, and helped achieve significant operational success through methods that were innovative, effective, and ethically complicated. The 74 transport aircraft destroyed, the hundreds of enemy combatants killed, the disruption to German logistics operations, all of it stemmed from one moment of curiosity about prayers broadcast on an unexpected frequency. And in the end, perhaps the most important part of the story isn't the tactical innovation or the strategic impact, but the fact that Harper spent the rest of his life thinking about those German voices, carrying them in memory, refusing to forget that his victories were built on other men's deaths, that effectiveness and morality don't always align, that war demands choices between terrible options and leaves survivors to make whatever peace they can with what they've done. The prayers were heard. The men who prayed died. The man who heard them survived and remembered. That's not redemption or justification or moral resolution. It's just what happened, stripped of the comfortable abstractions that make war seem cleaner than it is. And sometimes acknowledging complexity without resolving it is the closest we can come to honesty about what violence costs and who pays those costs and what we owe to the people, enemy and friend alike, who die in wars they didn't start and couldn't stop.